The chime of the bell beckons us into a sacred time. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, where we widen love's circle by honoring the inherent worth and dignity of all, by advancing justice and religious pluralism, and by inspiring an ever-deepening spirituality. We extend a heartfelt and inclusive invitation to join us in meaningful worship and in service to the world. We greet all those who join us this morning, those here in our sanctuary, all of our many online viewers, así como el creciente número de participantes bilingües que nos acompañan desde sus hogares. Please make note that the responses that were once found in your order of service are now on these laminated cards. And while mask wearing in the sanctuary is currently optional, you are encouraged to continue to wear your mask if you are more comfortable doing so. And especially if you're visiting, we hope you'll join us in Channing Hall, which is right in there, after the service for coffee and conversation. And now, please join Dr. Rock and the Sanctuary Choir for our first hymn.
All right, please turn in your teal hymnals to number 1024. When the Spirit says do. When you find it, please rise in body or in spirit and join together as we sing.
We gather this morning with words inspired by outgoing president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. We gather from separate homes, from separate places, and join together in a community of radical welcome and acceptance. We gather to say welcome, to tell each other that each of us, that all of us have a place within this congregation, this community, and this world. We gather to say that the migrant, the undocumented, the refugee is welcome. We gather to say that whatever your tradition, whether you are Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Christian, atheist, Buddhist, humanist, you are welcome here. We gather to say that if you are gay or straight, woman or man, transgender or queer, you are welcome here. We gather to say that if you have a disability, visible or invisible, you are welcome. We gather in this community to proclaim that all are welcome, that love is more powerful than hate, that there is hope for justice, and that it is good to be together. Come, friends, let us worship.
Celebremos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz.
Please join me in reciting the covenant, which is found on the back of your order of service. Love is the spirit of our congregation. Service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to encourage one another. Thus do we covenant.
The eighth principle calls on us to build the beloved community through inclusion and accountability, dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Throughout the month of May, we'll be sharing member testimonials about why adopting the eighth principle during the annual meeting on June 4th is so important to them.
Hi, my name is Leslie Morrison. My family and I have attended FIRSTUU since 2018. I grew up colorblind. You know, the terminology used to discredit and minimize stories from people who don't appear to have white skin. Yeah, my colorblindness meant that I didn't think twice about being open to all ethnicities when we started the adoption process. Color obviously didn't matter. I was wrong. Becoming a mother to a black child 8 years ago ripped off the blinders I'd proudly worn as a good white person for years. Millie was not represented in the books, toys, or artwork in our home. I quickly began to notice when she was the only person of color in a room. People were constantly touching her hair and being far more critical of her than of my other two biological children. I saw the news differently. I noticed comments I'd never given a second thought to before. I realized I was in over my head and I turned to Black authors. I was well on the path of anti-racism when the racial unrest in 2020 began. That said, I was still not quite prepared for the white fragility Robin DiAngelo spoke about in her book and at General Assembly in 2019. I share all of this because some of you may think the eighth principle is unnecessary. You may think beloved community and dismantling racism are implied in the other 7 principles. My daughter and every single Black, Indigenous person of color deserves to be in a community they know is inclusive and is doing everything they can to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Privilege is thinking something isn't a problem because it's not your problem. Adopting the eighth principle ensures that everyone who walks into our church knows that their problems and experiences will not be dismissed. Thank you so much for considering the eighth principle. It means a lot to me and my family.
Thank you so much. I get to be in both services, so I get to hear them sing twice. And I like that. This is the part of the service where we recognize all the young people in the sanctuary because they're about to head out to do some really cool things with the amazing carol. So before you leave, I want you to know what an important part of this congregation you are and how much you are loved. And the people you are leaving back here are going to sing you out. And on the card, it's as you go. So, you going to lead us? I was supposed to acknowledge the choir, too, as they go, and I totally forgot. You're an important part of the church, too, and we love you. This is the time during the service when we pause for contemplation. Our lives may be hectic, we may often be distracted. So, with intention and care, we carve out this time to silence our minds and hearts. This is a time that some call meditation and others name prayer. Breathe with me the breath of life. Breathe in for loving, for acceptance, and with a sense of calm. Breathe out the sorrow, the division, and the stress. Inhale as we share this interwoven, intricate web of affinity. Exhale as we feel one another's presence. Breathe with me as we gather to do the holy work of kinship and support. Open your mind, open your heart. God, of many names, holy, unnameable one, holy, unknowable one, mystery beyond all our naming. In this sacred time and in the midst of this community in covenant, we bring hearts seeking hope. We gather together to not only gather strength from the ineffable that is greater than ourselves, but create hope from our shared love, values, and intentions. As each day brings news that could easily cause despair, may the light of hope guard our hearts from the blight of cynicism and bitterness. Because ours is not the only gauge of time, help us to persevere, to continue to make the choices that move our world toward the beacons of sustainability and justice, even if we do not personally cross that mountain. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. Ketty Outlaw had surgery Tuesday. We hold her in our hearts as she recovers and begins rehab. The father of K.C. Panjwani passed away Wednesday night. We offer condolences to his entire family. Longtime member Cynthia Conwell passed away early Thursday morning. A memorial service will be planned. Our hearts are with Wendy Van Sickle and all those close to Cynthia. A small service to remember Ken Walker, who passed away in February, will be held Saturday, June 10th at 11 a.m. in the church memorial garden. The memorial service for one-time member and peace activist Lee Lowe will be held at the church on July 15th at 2 p.m. We now turn to a practice inspired by African, indigenous, and pagan traditions. We say aloud or bring to mind those who we wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the beauty, diversity, and mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
Each week, our morning offering is shared with an organization that shares our Unitarian Universalist values and through which we may live out our principles in the world. Today, our shared offering will help support Planned Parenthood Gulf Coast. Planned Parenthood is America's most trusted provider of reproductive health care. To tell us more about Planned Parenthood is longtime member Mary Koch.
Good morning. Planned Parenthood in the United States was established in 1916. Currently, there are over 600 affiliates in the nation and around the world, and the Gulf Coast Planned Parenthood serves the Texas Gulf Coast as well as Louisiana. Planned Parenthood seeks a world in which all children are wanted and cared for. All individuals have equal rights and equal dignity. Sexuality is expressed with honesty, equality, and responsibility, and the decision to bear children is private and voluntary. As most of you know, Planned Parenthood is under siege by not only our Texas government, but also in other states, and of course, we know that Roe versus Wade has been overturned. Planned Parenthood offers a wide array of services. They offer reproductive health care services. They offer accurate sexual health information. They offer birth control and cervical testing, cervical cancer screening. Also, you may recall that our congregation is a reproductive justice congregation in which we have vowed to support individuals to make their own reproductive decisions, whatever they may be. The offering will now be taken, and I encourage you to give generously. Thank you very much.
Please join with me in the words to dedicate our offering found on your laminated pew card. To the work of this church, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these our offerings.
Our first reading this morning is The Change by Matthew P. Taylor. I can feel the change coming, like growing pains. I feel the change in my bones, pulling me, stretching me, forming me into the true I am. Can you feel it? The change in our bodies as we adapt, grow, change. The weight shifting and molding to fit this evolving body that we are in, guided by faith that this too will pass. We can survive this because our ancestors survived. Can you feel them in your DNA? You, a mixture of their particles that was molded to fit your spirit. Change and shift, mold and grow. Yet, in some ways, we stay the same. There ends the first reading.
Our second reading is from Congregational Polity by Natalie Fenimore. Our congregationalism gives authority and responsibility to each member of our congregations and communities, and it is a proclamation of their worth and dignity. It says, you are needed, you are valuable, you are central to the process of making a Unitarian Universalist religious community. The power of the individual member of our congregational and covenanted community is best held with humility. We are asked to recognize that our power is shared with other individuals and with those called as partners in leadership within our communities. This is the dance of congregationalism, sharing leadership, recognizing when individuals are best in position to lead or to move back, and making space for new ideas, change, and transformation. Congregationalism asks us to struggle as individual and as a body in order to determine the future of our faith. And while Unitarian Universalists value democracy, it is best not seen as democracy in the purely political sense. This is not about winning by vote alone, but rather as honoring the voices of all and listening to the call of conscience. Here ends the second reading.
And now we invite you to take a look at the screen above our heads and join together as we sing. Please rise in body or spirit.
I
Next month, at our annual congregational meeting, we will be voting on whether or not to adopt the eighth principle as a congregation. The principle was developed by two Unitarian Universalist lay people, Paula Cole Jones, who is a lifelong member of All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C., and Bruce Pollock Johnson, a longtime member of the Mount Airy congregation in Philadelphia. The text, which Leslie Morrison referenced in her testimonial at the start of the service, and which Charles Johnson and Earl and Georgette Dredge spoke about earlier in the month, reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness, working to build a beloved multicultural community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in the world, and in our institutions, This morning, I want to talk with you about why I'm in favor of adopting the resolution to pass the principle, and as a way of approaching the potential importance of the principle for our life together, I want to recall an episode from the congregation's history. A few months ago, you might remember that I shared with you a story around the congregation's 1954 decision to desegregate. In case you were not here that Sunday or you appreciate a refresher, it's worth recalling the history. 3 weeks after the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, outlawing school segregation, the members of the First Unitarian Church of Houston voted to become the first historically white congregation in the city to welcome people of all races for worship and into membership. It was not, as I told you, a decision without dust and heat. It put First Unitarian Universalist at the leading edge of racial justice. Some 10% of the membership resigned, deciding that they were more committed to white supremacy and segregation than they were the principles of Unitarianism. Many of them sent the minister at the time, the Reverend Horace Westwood, some pretty awful letters on the way out the door. They accused him of following the communist line and turning the church into an atheistic organization with a primary emphasis on left-wing politics. Reviewing the history of the congregation's archives, I found a story that the Reverend Bob Shibley, senior minister of the congregation from 1982 to 2002, liked to tell about those times. On more than one occasion, he shared that story from this pulpit. It's an account that was offered to him by the first African-American member of the church about becoming a member of First Unitarian. His name was Lavnell Henderson, and he's likely familiar to those of you who are longtime members. He was active in the congregation from the mid-1950s until around the time of his death in the late 1990s. In 1954, Lavnell moved to Houston to become a professor at Texas Southern University. A stranger to town, he decided, like many people, to try to find a religious community. Now, our congregation was not his first choice. The Sunday before he came to visit us, he visited one of the other churches along Main Street. Now, I have no idea whether it was First Presbyterian or St. Matthew's or St. Paul's. It doesn't matter, and frankly, it's probably better that we don't know. Because whatever church it was, the ushers there pulled a move prefiguring the one made by the arch-segregationist George Wallace a few years later. They stood in front of the church doorway and stopped him from entering their sanctuary. The next Sunday, Lavnell decided to see if we would be more receptive to him. No one stopped him when he walked up the steps leading from Fannin into the courtyard, and no one stopped him when he walked through the sanctuary doors. So he slipped in and found a seat someplace in the back pews, the ones that are still popular with visitors so that they can sneak out if the sermon is a little too boring. In one of his conversations with Bob Shibley, Lavnell recounted to Bob what happened next. There was a young white couple sitting a handful of pews in front of him. They turned around and looked at him, and then they got down and sat on either side of him. Lavnell told Bob that this made him anxious. I cannot quite imagine. I mean, here he is, an African-American man in the heart of the old Confederacy, a state where between 1882 and 1945, more than 750 people were lynched. The only black person in the room of an all-white church, having come in by himself after only the previous Sunday, being barred from another congregation that was deeply committed to segregation. I suspect anxious is not quite the word. But the intention of the young couple was not to make him anxious. Their names were Sol and Thelma Meltzer. They were the sort of people that we sometimes call pillars of the congregation. They served in a lot of volunteer roles, made a generous pledge, and people knew who they were and respected them. Lavnell thought they were coming over to tell him to leave. Instead, he related to Bob how they sat down next to him and made him know that he was welcome. Now, knowing how congregations work, I can assure you that this was a big deal. In 1954, in the segregated South, the Meltzers, pillars of the congregation, were essentially letting everybody else know that he was under their protection, and that if anybody was going to mess with him or tell him he wasn't welcome, they were going to have to mess with the Meltzers too. A few Sundays later, Lavnell joined the congregation, and his presence made it possible for a couple of weeks later the first African-American family to participate and join our religious education program. The names of Felicia Rashad, Debbie Allen, and Tex Allen, and their mother Vivian Allen might be familiar to some of you. They found a religious home here because Lavnell and Sol and Thomas were able to form a friendship within the walls of our sanctuary more than a decade before the legal collapse of Jim Crow. The three of them remained close friends and loyal to First Unitarian Universalist until they went the way of all flesh. Bob liked to share their story and what it meant for the congregation every so often. I think for him it represented the spirit of our community, our commitment to widening love's circle at its finest. We're going to come back to the story of Lavnell and Sol and Thelma at the end of the sermon. For now, I want to return to the proposed eighth principle and the denominational and congregational process around its adoption. Now, these are not the sort of things I normally preach about on a Sunday morning, but they're important. While Unitarian Universalists don't have a creed, we do have statements of shared values. These are expressed in the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The 8th principle was launched as an effort to make our commitment to anti-racism explicit. It was originally intended to be added to the current principles. However, a couple of years after its launch, the board of the Unitarian Universalist Association and then our General Assembly initiated the Article 2 Study Commission. That's where the current principles reside within Article 2, and the commission is charged with revising the text of them in its members' words because they provide a foundation for all of the work of our Unitarian Universalist Association and member congregations. The proposed revision will claim that the purpose of our association is the transformation of the world through liberating love. It will replace the existing principles with 7 shared values. It will substitute the 6 sources, which are each distinct, with a general statement about the sources which ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. This revision to Article 2 will include the intention behind the 8th principle in the value of justice. The text describing the value contains the sentences reading, "We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systematic oppression." Paula Cole-Jones, it should be noted, is not just one of the major forces behind the 8th principle. She is also a member of the Article 2 Study Commission and has played a significant role, I'm sure, in shaping the words that the Commission have proposed for the new Statement of Values. Now, the process behind all of this is that the revisions to Article 2 will be considered by the Association's General Assembly this year. The Assembly, for those who don't know, gathers together delegates from congregations throughout the United States. It's about 100 congregations, and they each get a say in the major decisions of our religious movement. This year, congregations will vote to decide whether or not to put the new text up for a year of study. And then at next year's assembly, the delegates will vote whether or not to incorporate the revisions of Article 2 into the association's bylaws. Our congregation has 6 lay delegates and 3 ministerial delegates, myself, Reverend Scott, and our minister emeritus, the Reverend Dr. Dan King. The proposed revisions to Article 2 have been circulated in many formats. You all got an email with them this week, and I hope that you've had a chance to read them. If you're not happy with them, there's actually still 2 opportunities still to change the proposed text. First, delegates can put forth amendments until June 5th for consideration at this year's General Assembly. And if you're interested in having a delegate from our congregation carry your amendment, please let our board president, Ron Cookston, who's back there, know, and he can connect you with one of the delegates. Second, next year, congregations, not individuals, will have the opportunity to make amendments to whatever text is passed at this year's General Assembly, assuming a text is passed. To that end, I've asked the board to call for a special congregational meeting in early November so that we can collectively review, decide upon, and figure out if we want to propose as a community an amendment to Article 2. Now, like I said, this is all a bunch more procedure about the institutional life of the Unitarian Universalist Association that I normally would ever get into in a pulpit. But given the potential impact for our religious movement of the changes being proposed, it's important to offer some overview of how the changes will unfold. Our commitment to democracy as a religious practice calls upon me and our church congregational leadership to let you know so that you can be as fully informed in a process that has us stating the shared values of our faith. Of course, the proposed changes to Article 2 raise the question, why are we even considering the 8th principle if the principles are going to be superseded anyways? Now, to my thinking, there's really 3 reasons. First, and perhaps most obviously, is that it will be a year before the new version of Article 2, with its reflection of the 8th principle, will become one of the association's official guiding documents. We should not wait a year to make clear our commitment to anti-racism. We live in a state governed by the politics of cruelty, whose political leadership is seeking to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion from public universities. We live in a country where a man can be lynched on a train, for that is exactly what happened to Jordan Neely. And the man who lynched him can receive over $2 million in donations for his legal defense. We live at a time where white supremacists are trying to reassert their dominance over a multiracial society. And it's important to be clear about our commitments. Second, there's no guarantee that the revisions to Article 2 will pass. If they do not, then there will continue to be a need to incorporate something like the eighth principle into our existing 7 principles. Third, if we choose to adopt the eighth principle as a congregation, we will be making a commitment as a congregation about our values, and our values specifically as a religious institution, and what it means to live into those values together. Now, I recognize I used some words there that makes many Unitarian Universalists blush, the word institution. Many of us like to think of ourselves as individuals first and foremost, and members of communities and stewards of institutions second. In some periods of the congregation's history, that pattern has been so pronounced that former Minister Webster Kitchell complained that during the 1960s, attacks on authority became a holy cause. He was commenting on the time period when the minister, his predecessor, the Reverend Horace Westwood, had led the congregation in its efforts to become more aligned with the civil rights movement. In recent years, we have tried to move the congregation to a collaborative model where the ministry is shared between the community and the professional staff. But whatever the case, we have congregations like this so that we might have places where we can come together to deepen our spiritual lives, mark life's passages, and work for justice in the world. These religious institutions that we form become carriers of, vessels for our spiritual lives. The institutional life, the structure of the congregation, our principles describing it, the vision, mission, and covenant, the principles of governance, the financial supports that we give, the budget, these are all things that make our life together and ministry together possible. Incorporating the eighth principle into our institutional life will make us make clear what kind of religious community we are trying to become. We'll be stating that we aspire to be one that is intentionally multicultural and multiracial and is committed to deconstructing racism and white supremacy. Now, I know that there are some people who don't think it is necessary to make such an explicit statement. Our anti-racist intentions can be clearly found in the first principle of our association. It calls for us to honor the worth and dignity of every person. They're spelled out in our other principles as well. The second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, also challenges us to commit ourselves to anti-racism. And the third, well, truthfully, it would be a somewhat tedious exercise to read each of the existing 7 principles and then describe how they challenge us to engage in the difficult work of anti-racism. Here, I return to the story of Lavnell Henderson, Sol, and Thelma Meltzer, and the Allen family. The community takes it as a point of pride that we were the first historically white congregation in the city to desegregate. In celebrating the story, though, perhaps we should consider why the church needed to desegregate in the first place. 10% of the congregation walked out the door shortly after Lavnell walked in. And so I think the question needs to be asked, why was that 10% comfortable being here in the first place? In 1954, the Universalist Church of America, one of the predecessors of the Unitarian Universalist Association, had as one of its statements of faith a commitment to the supreme worth of every human personality. Unitarians throughout the country could be found making similar claims, which is one reason why the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America consolidated into a single association in 1961. And yet, despite this commitment to honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every person, in 1954, 10% of the congregation felt that there was no connection between being a Unitarian and being a supporter of the civil rights movement. They felt it was just fine to support segregation. They felt that you could be a member of this faith community and be committed to white supremacy. And they were not alone. People like me like to celebrate Unitarian Universalism's long history of striving to build the beloved community and widening the circle of love. We preachers honor the abolitionists and activists from our tradition. We remark that Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, at the end of his life regularly participated in worship at All Souls in Washington, D.C. We share the story of how much of the money that was raised to fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry came from Unitarian pockets. We memorialize our martyrs to the civil rights movement, the Reverend James Reeve and Viola Liuzzo, who were killed in Selma, and we like to celebrate ministers like Horace Westwood, who marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on many occasions. We uplift the fact that we were the first tradition in North America to ordain women way back in the 1850s, that we've had lesbians and gay men openly serve as clergy since the early 1970s, and that we ordained transgender people in 1988. But we rarely speak about another truth. For generations, open white supremacists found no contradiction between Unitarianism or Universalism and their devotion to racism. John Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States. His commitment to white supremacy was so pronounced that historian Richard Hofstadter once described him as the marks of the master class. He was a Unitarian. So was Lothrop Stoddard, whose vile books from the early part of the 20th century continue to provide much of the architecture of contemporary white supremacist thought. Tucker Carlson's great replacement theory, you want to know where it comes from? Comes from him. There was a Universalist minister who was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan. And the founder of the Klan himself, the founder of the Second Klan, wrote approvingly of Unitarianism in one of his books and idolized Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, you might argue that devotees of that part of our tradition walked out the door in 1954 when Lavnall walked in, and when Sal and Lavnall and Thelma struck up their friendship. And I hope that you would be right. But of course, the story does not end there, does not end with Lavnell and Saul and Thelma. While First Unitarian Universalists desegregated in 1954, we've never really truly become a fully multiracial congregation. Yes, we've had African American members consistently since 1954. But the diversity of the congregation has never come close to approaching the diversity of the city. As I shared with you back in February, there's at least a clue in our archives about why this has been the case. In July of 1954, just a month after the congregational vote, the board president at the time, his name was William Gray, wrote a letter to the minister at the time, Horace Westwood, reporting that members of the youth group had made some friends with African Methodist Episcopal churches over in Freedmanstown in the 4th Ward. The youth group wanted to go over to their friend's church one Sunday and explain to them all about Unitarianism and the meaning of our resolution. Mr. Gray assured Reverend Westwood that he had discouraged the leader of the youth group from doing any such thing. He told the young man he reported to the minister such an action would be in the nature of proselytizing and counter to the spirit of the resolution. This congregation's decision did not mean, in his words, that we were going to go out looking for African American converts. Reverend Westwood apparently concurred with the board president. He took no action to reach out to the black community. He might welcome people like Lavnell and the Allen family when they walked in the door, but he was not about to go around devoting his energy to building a truly multiracial church. It might have been that losing 10% of the congregation just a few weeks earlier and suffering from their bile had taken too much of a toll. It could have been that he was not ready to truly widen love's circle. Maybe he and Mr. Gray were simply prisoners of his time, only able to see so far and do so much, just as we are prisoners of our own time. They were only willing to take so much of a stance against the South's segregation. I don't know. But what I know is this, is adopting the eighth principle as a congregation will challenge the board and challenge myself and the other staff leaders to make different decisions. It will explicitly commit this congregation, by extension the congregation's leadership, to building an anti-racist and multicultural church. When we make the congregation's budget, when we make decisions about programming or staffing, we will be challenged to ask ourselves, how are we holding ourselves accountable to an anti-racist vision? In this difficult hour when white supremacy is resurgent across the state and throughout the country, there is little work that we can do that could be more important. There is little work that we could do that would be more transformational. And there is little that we could do that would better honor the spirits of Lavnell Henderson and Sol and Thelma Meltzler. All those years ago, they helped this congregation start off on its journey to spiritual wholeness and started to work to become an anti-racist congregation devoted to widening love's circle for all. That we might continue that spiritual journey, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.
Now I invite you to open your hymnals, the gray ones, to number 18, What Wondrous Love. Please rise in body or in spirit and join together as we sing.
Please join me as we extinguish the chalice with the words found in your laminated pew card. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Let us leave this place ever more committed to the work of justice and anti-racism and transforming the world. May wondrous love within each of us stir even when our spirits are sinking down, so that we might do our part in building the beloved community. Go in peace, go in love. May our lives be a blessing. Amen. Thank you so much for watching our service today. We're glad you're part of our online community, where we welcome people who are diverse in faith, ethnicity, history, as well as gender identity and sexual orientation. There are many different ways you can get involved in our community. One you can do right now is by clicking like below or subscribing to our channel. If you're interested in joining our congregation, please email us at membership@firstuuhouston.org. Thanks so much for joining us.